Is there something wrong with you in 2026? The truth about your anger. You've probably heard that the Buddhist antidote to anger is goodwill, Mettā, sometimes translated as loving kindness. You may have tried it and found that there are times when it doesn't work. No matter how hard you try, it's difficult to generate goodwill for the person who cut in front of you in traffic, or one whose decisions are affecting your life in a negative way. You may have come to the conclusion that there's either something wrong with Buddhism or something wrong with you. I'm here to tell you tonight that neither is the case. Actually, Buddhism has many other tools for dealing with anger. Goodwill is only one of them. It's important to understand that there's a whole array of tools you can use to deal with anger when it comes up in the mind. I had a student once who would bring her son to the monastery. He was an autistic hyperactive child, a very difficult combination. As he grew into his teenage years, his anger became a real problem, so she brought him up to the monastery to have me teach him how not to be angry. I had to explain to her that that wasn't the way to approach the issue. The proper approach was to teach what to do when you do get angry. If you're told not to get angry, then you're left helpless when anger comes. It's better to realize that anger is a natural response in the mind, and that there are ways of dealing with anger that help you overcome it so that it doesn't affect your actions. Actually, anger is an important tool in your arsenal for basic survival. We often misunderstand the Buddhist attitude toward anger. We all know that Buddhism is very much like therapy, in the sense that the Four Noble Truths are like a doctor's prescription. There's suffering, there's a cause of suffering, the cessation of suffering, and the path to the end of suffering. It's very much like a doctor's diagnosis. There are the symptoms of the disease, there's the cause of the disease, and by attacking the cause of the disease, you put an end to it. We often assume that Buddhism would therefore have a therapeutic attitude toward anger, or an attitude that's similar to American therapy culture. That is, if you're angry, it's your problem. But that, of course, absolves everyone else in the world of responsibility for his or her actions, which is not a very skillful attitude to adopt. Actually, American therapeutic culture has two attitudes toward anger. One is that if you have anger inside, you should let it all out. Don't let it get bottled up. I have an older brother who believes in that. He believes that if he bottles up his anger, he'll get cancer. It hasn't been very good for his married life. I know other people who think, well, gee, you have to accept everything that comes your way and try to respond without anger. In that way, though, you become a Buddhist doormat, neither of which is a skillful approach to anger. The word skillful here is important. To understand any Buddhist teaching, you have to understand that the Buddha's basic distinction is between what's skillful behavior and what's unskillful behavior, and you have to apply that distinction in all areas. There was once an occasion when one of the Buddha's lay students was approached by a person who asked, "What does your teacher teach? Does he teach that the world is eternal?" Well, no. Does he teach that it's not eternal? Well, no. Infinite? No. Finite? No. The person went down the whole list of what were the big philosophical issues of the day. In each case, the lay student said, "The Buddha doesn't answer that question." The other person finally said, "Well, in that case, your teacher doesn't really teach anything at all, does he?" The lay student said, "No. There is one important distinction he makes between what is skillful and what is unskillful. That lies at the basis of everything in the Dhamma. You may call it dualistic, but it's a very useful dualism. When you're being wheeled into an operating room, you want your surgeon to understand the distinction between skillful and unskillful. It's also useful to have that distinction in mind in your own life. It's certainly important when dealing with anger. We're often taught that one of the basic Buddhist teachings is on acceptance, which can mean many things. It can mean accepting the situation around you, or it can mean accepting your anger. In either case, it's difficult to figure out exactly how you would balance that out unless you had the distinction between skillful and unskillful behavior to fall back on. For one thing, I've never been able to find the Pali word for acceptance. I don't think they had such a word. Think about that for a while. They did have the words for skillful and unskillful, but you don't see a Pali term for acceptance at all. The Buddha often taught that there are problems in the mind for which the skillful response is to do something about it. There are other times when the skillful response is to just watch. Unfortunately, he doesn't give any simple A, B, C guidelines on how to know which is which. He does, however, give you guidelines on how to become the sort of person who can begin to make this distinction and be observant enough so that you can start coming to your own conclusions. And the issue of anger is a very important one here. Anger arises when we see something wrong outside. There's either injustice, discourtesy, or disrespect. As for dealing with the issue of disrespect, I don't know about you, but many times I find that Miss Manners has more wisdom than most Dhamma books. She had a great column once on the causes of crime, in which she said, "You read the newspapers and you begin to realize that the major cause of crime these days is senselessness. There was another senseless shooting, another senseless robbery, another senseless murder." And as she said, we used to have such good sensible crime, as in crimes over love or money. Any motivation for crime aside from love or money, our culture thinks, is senseless. She went on to say, however, that if you look a bit deeper, you begin to realize that a major cause of crime is, and you're not going to believe this, bad manners. You hear people say, "They didn't show me any respect. They were dissing me." There's a lot of disrespect in the world, and people will, many times, commit crimes based just on that. At other times, it's a deeper issue. Real injustices are being done out there. The question is, what to do about them? Often we see a situation that we don't like. Anger arises, and we try to think of what to do about the situation while the anger is still in the mind. From the Buddha's perspective, the problem is not so much that we want to do something about the injustices, but that we allow the anger to color our perception of the situation and of what should be done. So he's not telling us to simply accept things as they are and try to swallow your anger, feeling that we're to blame for the anger. Rather, he's saying that we have to deal with the anger in such a way that it doesn't get in the way of responding in an appropriate way or a skillful way to what we see as wrong. Once you get the anger out of the way, there are two things that can happen. One is that you may see that the situation is not as bad as you thought it was, but simply that your opinions had colored the situation. The other is that you can see the situation really is that bad, that something should be done, and the question is, what, when, and where. In other words, when is the right time, where is the right place, and what is the best thing to say in that time and place. So Buddhism is not saying that if you have anger, you're a bad person and it's all your fault. Rather, it's saying that the anger is the unskillful element in the equation of sensing that something should be done. And that's what you want to deal with. The main problem with anger is that it tends to block out certain parts of the mind. There's a kind of clarity that comes with tunnel vision, but it's an unfortunate clarity, for often after the action is done, you've got to live with the regret as your mind begins to open up, and you see from a larger perspective, that was really stupid, I shouldn't have done that. We had a case in Thailand one time where two young men living near the monastery got into an argument. Now, people often think that those living in monasteries in Thailand deal with nothing but sweet Thai peasants, who are as pure as the driven snow. For one thing, they don't have snow in Thailand. But also, in the village in which our monastery was located, we had a murder. There was prostitution, there were drunks, there was promiscuity. all kinds of stuff going on. These two young men got into an argument one night in the local store, and one of them stalked off and went home, got his sickle, hid behind a tree, and waited for the other man to head home. As the other man headed home, not knowing that the first man was hiding behind a tree, of course, they got into a scuffle, and the man with the sickle almost beheaded the other guy. Then he stuffed him in a burlap bag and dragged him down into a reservoir. And at that point, he probably realized that he'd done something very stupid. Now, many of us don't go to the extent of murdering the people with whom we're angry, but there is that potential in the human heart, and you have to watch out for it. So we've got to get the anger out of the way, for often, as the Buddha said, and in fact, this is one of his reflections to help us deal with anger. Under the power of anger, you will do precisely the things that your enemy would wish to see you do. An enemy likes to see you ugly, and when you're angry, you're ugly. He would like to see you destroy your friendships, and many times, under the power of anger, you destroy your friendships. He would like you to act in ways that go against your own advantage, and many times when you're angry, you get things mixed up. What looks like it'd be good for you turns out to be not, and vice versa. So the dangers of anger are real, but this doesn't mean that acting on injustice has those same dangers. It's simply a question of getting the anger out of the way and then looking at the situation with clear eyes. This is the Buddha's attitude toward anger. It's not that if things are bad and you're angry at them, then it's your fault, but rather that if you want to give an appropriate response to a bad situation, you have to get the anger out of the way. Then you can see things more clearly. There's a series of tools that are useful for that. One of which, as I just stated, is to help get rid of that tunneling of your tunnel vision that makes a particular action seem like precisely the thing you want to say or do in that situation. You have to step back a bit to make sure that certain brain synapses have not been cut off in order to make that decision. The synapses that tend to get cut off are two qualities that the Buddha said are the protectors of the world. One is a sense of shame. Now, shame here does not mean being ashamed of yourself. It means looking at a possible action that you might do and realizing that it's beneath you. It's something below your values, below your sense of who you are. In other words, the Buddha's not advocating the shame that's the opposite of pride. He's advocating the shame that's the opposite of shamelessness. This skillful kind of shame protects you from a lot of things. It's a very useful attitude to have. You realize that shame here is not a matter of having a low opinion of yourself. It's actually part of having a fairly high opinion of yourself, realizing that certain actions are beneath you and are not really worthy of you. The second attitude that's a protector is a quality called ottappa, which means fear of the consequences of your actions. Again, this is a very useful fear. You realize that you're about to do something that you're going to regret for the rest of your life, so you don't want to do it. The problem is that these two qualities of mind are precisely the ones that get cut off when anger comes barging in. You find it easier to do and say things that otherwise, in your right mind, you would never even consider doing or saying. What you've got to do is to get rid of that tunneling mind state. To do that, the Buddha has you look at things from a larger perspective. He recommends that the attitudes worth developing to deal with anger are all four of what he called the Brahmaviharas. Mettā, or goodwill, is one of them, but another important one is equanimity. We often think that equanimity is simply accepting things and having no reaction at all, but that's not what equanimity means. It means looking at things from a larger perspective and getting a sense of your priorities, that is, what's important, what's not important, and developing equanimity for the unimportant things, where you can't make a difference, so that you can focus on areas where you can. It also involves reminding yourself that when you do respond to a situation, it's going to have consequences in the long term, so you want your response to be focused and wise. In order to remind yourself of that fact, The Buddha has you look at the human situation from a larger perspective. One of his passages for dealing with anger against someone is to think, this person has done something bad to me in the past, but what should I expect? This person has done something bad to people I love. What should I expect? This person has done something good to people I hate. What should I expect? And so on. Then from the past tense, he brings it into the present tense for all three actions. Either bad things to me, bad things to people I like, or good things to people I hate. What should I expect? This is the human condition. Are you going to ask the entire human race to do good things to you, good things to the people you like, or bad things to your enemy? That's not the human condition. You're in the wrong place. The world doesn't act that way. The final reflection in this list, he says, is resolving not to get worked up over impossibilities. You cannot expect everyone in the world to act in a pleasing or in a good way. Again, this is not saying that you should let the world be as it is, but it serves to remind you that injustice is not an extraordinary thing in this world. And because it's not extraordinary, it doesn't give you extraordinary rights to do and say as you like without thinking about the consequences. This is an important point to reflect on because often when you're angry over a little injustice, it's the biggest thing, it's the worst thing, the most outrageous thing that anyone has ever done. I used to think that it was very strange to think about these things as a universal part of the human condition. I thought, my gosh, that makes it even worse. Everybody's dying, everybody's suffering injustice. But when you back up a little bit, you realize that it's not just you. People ask, when there's injustice done to them, why me? And the answer is, because everybody suffers this. It's amazing, but that does help lighten the load a little bit. You're not being singled out for abuse by the universe. It also reminds you, as I said, that because injustice is not extraordinary, it doesn't give you extraordinary rights to go and bomb Baghdad. You have to think, given that other people's actions have karmic consequences, mine will have karmic consequences as well. When you step back in that way, it begins to put the situation into a better perspective. Then the question becomes, okay, what's the best thing to do right now? Am I in a mental state where I can perceive that? If not, you've got to look at your anger. When looking at anger, it's important to divide it into three parts. There's the actual anger as a mental state, there's the object of the anger, and there's the physical reaction in your body that comes from the anger. Our problem is that we tend to mix all of these things together. They all seem to be parts of one and the same thing. Now, looking at any Buddhist teaching on anything, you realize the Buddha has two ways of analyzing an issue. One is to analyze things into their component parts. The other is to see things in terms of causal relationships. In dealing with anger, you've got to use both approaches. The first step, as I said, is to take the three component factors of anger apart. When dealing with anger, you often find that the easiest thing to deal with first is the physical reaction. It can also be the most dangerous part of the anger, because your heart is racing, your stomach is all churned up, and you've just got to get it out of your system. We often think that getting something out of our system means striking back. You think, oh, I'd really like to say this. This is my chance to tell my boss off after all the times he's been a real bastard. Then, of course, you regret it for a long time to come. But it's that sense of physical displeasure, the physical discomfort that comes with the anger. That's what you've got to get out of your system. This is where breath meditation comes in to offer an alternative way, a skillful way to get it out. It's useful to know that by breathing a certain way, you can calm down your heart rate. Breathing a certain way, you can breathe through any sense of tension in your body that comes along with the anger. This is one way you can prepare yourself for dealing with anger when it strikes. When you're sitting and meditating, try to find out what ways of breathing will have different physiological effects. What ways of being sensitive to your body, in the sense of there being patterns of tension here and there in the body, are helpful in releasing the tension. How can you breathe through them so that they don't oppress you? And you can actually get the tension out of your system without having to yell at somebody or hit somebody. In traditional Thai medicine, there's a belief that the body has energy channels and negative energy should be let out your hands and your feet. So you might think of the tension, any tension building up in your body, as going out down your arms and legs and out your hands, out your feet. There was a man studying with my teacher. He was a retired Air Force general. He had flown in the Korean War and apparently had bombed a number of people in the war. He came back to Thailand, and he spent the remainder of his life trying to make sure that he would be a stream enterer before he died, so that he wouldn't have to go to hell for all the people he had killed. He was a very avid meditator. It's an interesting motivation, but it seemed to work. He really meditated very hard. One day he was sitting under my hut. You know, in Thailand, the huts are built up by these stilts. And he was talking to a few people, discussing the Dhamma. A strong sense of energy, he said it was almost unbearable, started building up in him as he was talking. He didn't know what to do. It just so happened that at that point I walked past him, so he grabbed hold of my arm. I felt the energy like an electric current. It went up my arm and down out my legs into the ground. I was like a lightning rod for him. It taught me a lesson, that these energy channels they talk about really exist. So when you find that there's that tension in the stomach and your heart is racing, think of ways of breathing through the tension to get it out your system. That way, you can attack the anger by coming through the back door. Then, when there's no longer that feeling of oppression inside the body, you can actually look at the mental state and the object of your anger and see them in a much calmer light. You can look at the situation for what it is because you've taken that element out. Other times, you find that you can actually deal directly with the anger first. You can look at the state in the mind and realize, this is a very unpleasant state to have in my mind. If you have goodwill for yourself, why are you burdening yourself with this anger? I'll get back to this issue in a moment. But you find that, as you think through the situation, it's really not as bad as you originally thought. But your heart is still racing. Many times people will misread this and say, well, I must still be angry. Remember, anger is a mental state. It's not a physical state. Your mind churned up those hormones in your body. They haven't yet left your bloodstream, so of course the heart is still going to race for a while. Of course, there are going to be physical symptoms. But don't think that just because the physical symptom is there, that the mental state is still there as well. Often the mental state is gone, and it's just a matter of letting things in the body calm down on their own. So you can attack the anger either from the physical side by breathing through the tension, or if you found that you've attacked it through the mental side and it's gone, don't misread the physical symptoms. They're the residue of the anger, so you breathe through them to dissolve them. Another way of dealing with the anger is to look at the object of the anger as separate from the anger itself. This is the point where you might want to look at the person's actions and get a better perspective on them. Is this person worthy of my being angry? Sometimes they seem to be, and other times you realize, well, no, it's not really worth it. That's when you can actually begin to spread goodwill to that person. Before you spread goodwill to other people, though, spread some goodwill to yourself. As I said, if you're letting yourself get worked up about the anger, if you're just feeding on the anger, you're not really feeding yourself well. The mind does have a tendency to feed. In fact, the Buddha said that's the definition of suffering. The mind's feeding on the 5 aggregates. In the case of anger, it's feeding on feelings, perceptions, and thought constructs. This is junk food for the mind. If you could take a picture of the mind feeding on the anger, what kind of picture would it be? One that you'd be proud to pass around to your friends? Not really. So as you divide the anger into these 3 components, you begin to see that the connections that seem so strong as you take them apart all begin to weaken. You look at the object strictly as an object of the anger in and of itself, without necessarily connecting it to the anger. The anger as a mental state, the anger as a physical state, you begin to see divisions between them. As they get divided, and the strength of each one is no longer building on the other, they both begin to fall apart. That's when you can decide what should be done. You're in a better position to see things for what they are. You can ask yourself, is now the time and place to say something? If you haven't been able to wrestle the anger down, you say, well, no, not yet, okay? No matter how much I feel like saying something, I'll have to wait for some other time. Or, if you see that there's something that should be said, should be done right now, you're now in a much better space. The mind has opened up a little bit. It doesn't have that same tunnel vision blocking off your sense of shame and your fear of the consequences of the action. That's taking the anger apart into its component parts. Then, if you have time, you can start using the Buddha's other approach, viewing the anger as part of a cause and effect process. Where does this anger come from? Why do you want to feed on it? The Buddha said you don't really understand something until you understand two very important things about it. One is seeing the drawbacks. Often the drawbacks of anger are obvious after the fact. The other thing to look for is the allure. Why do you like being angry? This is the part of the analysis that probably demands the most honesty. We don't like to think of ourselves as the sort of person who really enjoys being angry. But if that enjoyment weren't there, we wouldn't engage in it. Something within us gets a good kick out of the idea that I finally can say what I've wanted to say. I've got a real emotion here, a real passion here. My life suddenly has some color. Whatever the allure is, you've got to look for it. It varies from person to person. Sometimes people feel that it's their sign that I'm a real warrior type. I'm not a wimp. I can stand up for myself and hold my own. But you know, real warriors don't go around proving that they're warriors. In fact, they try to hide the fact, because one of the worst things you can do is to let other people know that you've got a few tricks up your sleeve. Years back, someone gave me a biography of Eisenhower, which I thought was a strange thing to do. But as I said, when reading non-Dhamma books, you often get more Dhamma than you do from a lot of Dhamma books. This biography actually contained a very important lesson. During the 1950s, when everybody was rattling sabers about the communist threat and what America had to do about this threat, that we had to attack here, had to attack there, Eisenhower kept saying no. He was probably the only person in the country who could get away with that. After all, he had proven himself in World War II. He didn't have to go out and prove himself any further. He wasn't the sort of person who was staying in the Texas National Guard during a certain war and suddenly had to prove some points. He'd already shown that he wasn't a coward. So he was able to keep us out of a lot of wars during the 1950s precisely because he realized that if these battles cannot be won, then it's not the time to fight. That's the sign of a true warrior, picking your battles, when to fight, when not to fight. Sometimes many of us think that when anger comes, that's our chance to show that we're real fighters, that we're not cowards. But think about it. There's a time and a place for responses, and you want to make sure that your responses are skillful and that you choose your battles wisely. So, look at the issue of why you like being angry, what thrill, what allure you find in the anger. Look for that. And often you'll find that seeing the allure for what it is will undercut the desire to act on the anger. Buddhism offers many different tools for dealing with anger, not just goodwill. There is that famous story in the canon where the Buddha said, "If thieves are savagely cutting you limb by limb with a two-handled saw, you should start with goodwill for them." I have a student out in San Diego who, whenever she reads anything in the Pali canon she doesn't like, goes ballistic, and she went really ballistic over this one. What is the Buddha telling us? To be pushovers? No. He's basically teaching you a parable. You remember it much more easily than if he had said, If people say nasty things to you, then spread goodwill to the nasty person, okay? You don't remember that. When he says, if people are cutting you limb by limb with a two-handled saw, then spread goodwill to them. You remember that. Secondly, you realize that if your boss is yelling at you, or your partner's yelling at you, it could be worse. They're not sawing you into little pieces. Yelling is not the worst thing that anyone has done in the world. One of my favorite stories in the canon is of a monk who's going off to a very savage part of India. He comes to take leave of the Buddha, and the Buddha says to him, "You know, people there are really rough. What if they yell nasty things at you?" The monk says, "Well, I'll remind myself that these are very civilized people and that they're not hitting me. What if they hit you? I'll remind myself that these are very civilized people in that they're not stabbing me with a knife. What if they stab you with a knife? I'll remind myself that these are very civilized people in that they're not killing me. What if they kill you? Well, other people have committed suicide. At least my death won't be a suicide." So remember that. It helps to keep the day-to-day irritations in perspective. The Buddha does, though, teach you to have goodwill. That's one of the techniques for dealing with anger, but he reminds you that there are others as well. There's one in which you reflect on how, by acting under the power of anger, you're doing precisely what your enemy would like you to do. Now, the psychology of this reflection is not one based on goodwill for your enemy. It's based on, I hate that bastard. I don't want to satisfy him. It's spite, but it is a realistic way of dealing with the psychology of anger. If you're really angry at that person, the first thing you think isn't, well, I should have goodwill for this person. May he be well. May he be happy. Whatever. You think, I don't want to give him the satisfaction of seeing me destroy myself. That's a good way of using the psychology of anger to get out of anger. Once you've kind of gotten the anger out in the fresh air a little bit, then you can start thinking in broader terms. For example, about the fact that you've probably angered other people in the world. So the fact that you're getting angered right now isn't one of the major injustices of the human race. However, if there are situations that really are unjust, where you need to make a difference, you want to make sure that your difference has been handled well. This is why reflecting on the universality of injustice is not meant to make you give up. It's to remind you that the reason there's so much injustice in the world is that people say, well, this person's been unjust, therefore I have the right to punish him. That, of course, breeds more injustice, because it's not a skillful reaction. But if you realize that, okay, it's ordinary for there to be injustice in the world, but this time I want to respond skillfully so as to at least help break the cycle this time around. When you can think in those terms, then you can give more energy and conviction to dealing with your anger properly. You can analyze the anger first in terms of its three parts: the physical side, the mental side, and the actual object of the anger, as three separate things, taking them on separately rather than all at once. You can also look at the causal pattern, exactly what inside you makes you want to feed on the anger, or gives you a sense that your anger is a good thing, that it's a good thing to get it out of your system through retaliation, whatever those unskillful thoughts are. What kind of allure do they have? Why do you like feeding on them? When you can approach the anger in this way, it makes you much more effective in dealing with situations as they arise. You're much less likely to destroy friendships, much less likely to breed the cycle of continuous unskillful responses in the world. The Buddha's not asking you to be a milquetoast. He's not asking you to be a doormat. Years back, my teacher had a student who was a seamstress. She had a customer walk into her store one day, someone who knew that she was a practicing meditator. She asked the price of certain dresses and other things that the seamstress could make. The seamstress quoted her prices, and the other person said, "Well, gee, you're a practicing Buddhist. Why are you charging so much? Shouldn't you be asking just for enough to get by, instead of asking for a big markup?" Now, the The seamstress knew she wasn't asking for a big markup. Her prices were perfectly fair, but she didn't know how to respond. So she went to see my teacher and asked, "What should I say in a case like that next time?" My teacher said, "Tell the person, 'Look, I'm not practicing the Dhamma in order to be stupid. When there is injustice in the world, when people are treating you unfairly, you don't want only to roll over. If it is the time to roll over, then roll over skillfully. But if it's not the time to roll over, respond in another way, skillfully. But make sure you're in the right mental state for knowing what's the skillful and what's the unskillful thing to do at that time and place.' Once you clear up the issue like this, you see that, on the one hand, the Buddha's attitude toward anger is very realistic, based on the fact that there is genuine suffering in the world. But one of the great ironies of life, that we also cause suffering for ourselves by our unskillful reaction to what's going on in the world. So when he has you focus on your own inner problems like this, he's not saying that you're the one to blame. Simply that if you want to deal effectively outside, you've got to take care of some stuff inside first. Clean up the mess inside, clean up the unskillful attitudes inside. Then you can respond in an appropriate way outside. On the other hand, you can also see that in dealing with the anger, there are many more tools in your toolbox than simply trying to spread goodwill to the other person. One of them is reminding yourself of the drawbacks of acting on anger, and particularly that whoever is treating you unjustly would be happy to see you act on your anger. Often that diffuses the situation right there. When someone comes at you in an angry way, yet you don't respond with anger, they don't know how to react. Anger is a game many people play, and they know the moves. I say this, and this person's going to have to say that, but you don't. That right there often knocks them off their feet. You can also regard equanimity as a way of encompassing the general scheme of things in deciding where to focus your efforts. As I said, equanimity is not simply accepting things, it means having a sense of priorities. What do I have to accept? What can I not change? If there are things that cannot be changed, why should I waste my energy on them? Each of us has only a limited amount of energy, so let's focus the energy where we can make a change, where we can make a constructive difference. This is the teaching of equanimity. It doesn't mean simply being blasé or indifferent about things. It means having a very clear sense of priorities and learning to distinguish what you can do from what you can't. When you see that the Buddha's attitude toward anger really is a very helpful and skillful one, and that he also gives you many tools, then you can learn how to use the tools, both when you're in the trenches, when you're actually confronted by someone doing something that makes you angry, and also when preparing yourself beforehand. Often when we're meditating, we think of the mind as so pure. How could it ever give rise to anything else again, aside from these nice, pure mental states? Well, you know it's got the potential. When the mind is in a clear state, you can start thinking about how to handle difficult situations that may come up in the future. How am I going to be prepared the next time someone curses me? Or whatever. Remember that the skills you learn on the meditation cushion are precisely the ones you need to use when anger comes up. Learning to be in touch with your breath is a very skillful one, because often someone says something and it strikes you the wrong way, but you're so busy or so distracted that you haven't paid it much attention. But it's there. If you're sensitive to your breath, you'll see it. That'll alert you so that you don't have to wait till the end of the day when you realize that something is very wrong with you as you're coming home, shaking. You learn to deal with it right away, simply by breathing through the tension, looking at the situation, and then coming from a much better place inside. So, those are some of my thoughts on dealing with anger. I'll end the talk here.